Okay. I'm not sure whether I'm kind of happy with going last or not, because on the one hand, you don't get to rip my ideas apart in open space. On the other hand, it'd be kind of quite nice to have people discussing what I'm going to talk about. So hopefully it'll at least provoke some conversation later. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? I did turn it on. That sounds better. Can you hear me at the back? No.
Let me check the mic placement. I think it's being muffled by your...
How about that? Is that better? Yes. Great. All right. I'm not going to speak to start off with. End of a 2-day conference. Everybody's pretty tired, I imagine, so I thought I would just kind of start off with a bit of music. Let's hope the technology works here. Feel free to join in once you know the words.
No is no, no is always no. If they say no, it means 1,000 times no. No plus no equals no. All no's lead to no, no, no. Eyebrows low, mouth in the shape of the letter O. Pardon me? No. Excuse me? No. May I stay? Can I go?
No.
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 Do this?
No.
Don't do that?
No.
Sit, stay, roll over?
No. No. No.
Pointing, eyebrows low, mouth in the shape of the letter O. Red means stop, do not go. No, no, no.
I like to think of that as the consultant song. It's also basically the answer to the question, isn't it, common sense? So if you're kind of wanting to get back, you have your answer. Thank you very much. Safe travels. It's also quickest closing keynote ever. It's also kind of it's really what I used to do as a consultant. Kind of go into organizations and you see their tricky problems, and generally they brought you in because of the problems, and the first thing you do is look at what they're doing and the processes they're using, and you just say, no, no, no. You don't want to do it like that. And I'm trying to avoid doing that now. I'm trying to go into places with a slightly different kind of mindset, which is I'm going to learn about what they're doing, and I'm trying to understand why they're doing it that way. And then I'm going to decide whether to say no. And sometimes I will say no. Sometimes after kind of doing that understanding, you kind of figure out that there are different ways. And sometimes you go in and you kind of go, okay, and I can see why you're doing that now. There's a good reason for that, and maybe you should carry on doing that. So the challenge then becomes, how do you do a job as a consultant? If you're not going in with a kind of a fixed answer and a fixed solution, what kind of guides your decision-making process? So that's where I think heuristics come into it. So we'll kind of just look at a quick definition of heuristics. So I took this from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. Heuristic is something involving or serving as an aid to learning, discovery, or problem-solving by experimental and especially trial and error methods. And then the other one was of or relating to exploratory problem-solving techniques that utilize self-educating techniques as the evaluation of feedback to improve performance. I really like both of those definitions because it kind of picks up on, I think, some key words of what we're trying to do when we're trying to take organizations through change. We need to learn, and they need to learn. So we need some way of aiding that learning and discovering how to solve their problems. We're not just going to give them a solution. We want them to learn sometimes we don't know what the right solution is. And it's usually exploratory, so exploratory techniques to improve performance. I'm going to kind of talk about the notion of heuristics and how I think that applies to Kanban, and how we can then use that, if we can use heuristics to help our understanding of Kanban, how we can then hopefully get better results when we're doing our jobs coaching and changing organizations. Heuristics is one of those things that I kind of came across 3 times probably. I kind of have this own little personal heuristic, you could call it, which is when an idea hits me 3 times independently, it probably means I should start paying attention to it. I'm not quite figured out whether that's just because I'm a bit slow on the uptake sometimes and something has to hit me 3 times before I kind of realise it, or whether it's if something kind of gets raised into my kind of consciousness 3 times from separate sources, that probably means it's a good idea. Probably a bit of both. So they're kind of the three areas that I came across heuristics. I'm going to kind of just go through each of those and then come back and talk about what that means for our understanding of Kanban. So the first one we've already seen, Knevin. I kind of picked up the idea from Dave Snowden, and Dave's already talked about some of this, so I don't need to spend a huge amount of time on it. The important things here are the idea that you've got the ordered domains on this side, and on this side you then got, you can use, it's valid to use good practice and best practice. Best practice for kind of the simple problems, good practice for the complicated problems. But on the other side then, when you've got the unordered, and you don't have causality, we have emergent practice. So when I first picked up heuristics, it's because Dave was talking about the use of heuristics to help guide and create the emergent practice. Because you've got no causality. So you can look and find things retrospectively coherent, but that doesn't mean that you can repeat them again. So we need to kind of come up with our own practices, and we can use heuristics. And then specifically, I kind of try to find a definition from Dave, and this is kind of the closest I've got. So if you go to cognitiveedge.com, Dave blogged a post called Rules is Rules in January, where he says we need a clear rule for when or who we can break the rules, and heuristics that apply on the other side of the boundary. So we can use rules on the ordered side. When we cross over onto the unordered side, we need heuristics. And if you have to break the rules, then that's okay, it'll happen, but you then have to follow the heuristics. And if you're following the heuristics, you then also kind of goes on a bit, I didn't want to put too many words on a page. The heuristics aren't going to guarantee success, but as long as you follow the heuristics, that's okay. And Dave has kind of his own 3 heuristics for dealing with complex systems. Distributed cognition. Kind of she talked a little bit about this morning, wisdom of the crowds. The idea that you kind of create a network of people and the knowledge is spread throughout the network rather than kind of that knowledge coming through a kind of a command and control top-down structure. So creating a network of people and then leveraging the distributed cognition there. Disintermediation. And disintermediation is really putting the data directly in front of the people who are going to use the data. Are not kind of hiding it or kind of manipulating it or trying to summarize it through some kind of intermediate format. We want to be able to access and see that data directly. And finely grained objects, kind of using lots of small building blocks, which then give complex systems resiliency. Distributed cognition then, we can kind of relate that to the way we try and put together cross-functional teams and collaborative teams rather than just kind of having these silos. So we can still have the silos, but we kind of create a distributed cognition across the silos. And then disintermediation is pretty much what we're doing when we're putting together visualizations, when we're putting together our Kanban boards. We're trying to put that data, our understanding of the work and the workflow in people's faces, so everybody kind of has that same understanding. And also, I think things like the delivering small increments of software. Working software is our primary measure of progress from the Agile Manifesto principles. It's another form of disintermediation. rather than kind of trying to describe the software that you're building through a requirements document and through design documents. So actually build the software and put it in front of the users, and then we get that real feedback. And then finely grained objects. We have small teams. We like to have small user stories, small object-oriented objects, small applications, lots of these kind of small things that you can then build together. I was thinking of drawing a bit of Lego, but I didn't want to steal Hacken's thunder, but kind of finely grained object, lots of little Lego pieces, and then you can build lots of different configurations of things from those finely grained objects. So that's kind of the Cynefin aspect to it, which is we use heuristics to create the emergent practice. And these are fairly generic complexity heuristics. And we can kind of look at them and try and help us understand, but maybe they're not that kind of, don't help us exactly what to do. So then the next useful reference was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Anybody read this? Okay, a few people. He talks about the way we use heuristics in order to make decisions sometimes. And this book is kind of quite a dense read, the book. And actually I kind of got the Kindle version, and I discovered that the Kindle has a couple of appendices which summarize the book in a couple of short papers. So I kind of prefer to reading those. But he kind of puts it together into kind of a nice overarching narrative. He describes a heuristic as a simple procedure that helps find adequate, though often imperfect answers to difficult questions. And the word comes from the same root as eureka. Again, adequate, though often imperfect. They're not going to guarantee success. They're certainly not going to guarantee the perfect answer, but they should give you an adequate answer. And I like the notion that it comes from the same word as eureka. Eureka are these kind of, eureka is associated with new ideas, things that haven't been thought of before. So we use heuristics to come up with those eureka moments. And he talks about the way we make decisions. Effectively, we use these heuristics to substitute a difficult question with an easy question. So kind of try a couple of examples out. I've written them down because I can never remember them exactly. So we'll use the first one, kind of the letter K. So we'll kind of do a show of hands on this. So we're going to consider the letter K. So is the letter K more likely to appear as the first letter of a word or of the third letter of a word? So if you think it's more likely to appear as the first letter of a word, raise your hand. In English. Good point. All right. And if you think it's more likely to appear as the third letter of the word, put your hand up. Okay. So the people who thought the first letter, why? So who put their hand up for the first bit? If you think it's more likely it's the first letter of the word.
In Kanban, it's the first letter, right?
Okay. Yeah. And what about the people who put their hand up for the third letter?
There are a lot more words that have at least 3 letters in them.
Okay. All right. So what most people do when they answer this is most people say that the first answer, they say they think there's more letter with the first letter is the letter K. So that kind of didn't quite work out there, and I'm kind of wondering whether you thought it was a trick question, so you were going the other way. But he talks about the availability heuristic. So what you're actually doing in order to answer that question, instead of saying, I don't know how many words there are that begin with the letter K, and I don't know how many words there are that have the letter K as the third letter, so what I'll do is I'll substitute with how many words can I think of? How many words are all available or that come to mind quickly that have K as the first letter versus K as the third letter? And typically you can think of more words that begin with the letter K. So most people kind of plump for that answer. Whereas actually, in English, there are more words that have K as the third letter. So if you said K as the third letter, you were correct. But the other one then, so let's read this. So I'm going to describe somebody called Steve and then ask you a question. So Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Let me read that again for you. Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. All right, so is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? So hands up if you think Steve's more likely to be a librarian. All right, hands up if you think Steve's more likely to be a farmer. All right, it's about 50-50. So the answer is that Steve is more likely to be a farmer because statistically there are more farmers than librarians. But what we do when we're trying to answer that question is we do what's called the representativeness heuristic. So we substitute the answer, is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer, with the question, what does Steve sound most like, a librarian or farmer? And this description is deliberately kind of intended to make it sound like what our stereotypical librarian is. So heuristics then I kind of like the idea of substitution. We use heuristics to substitute a difficult question with an easier question. Now, the challenge with that then is that quite often we get the answer wrong because that easy question leads us down the wrong path. But sometimes it gets us to a good enough. So this idea that it gets us an adequate answer, but it's quite often going to be imperfect. So when we're dealing with complex problems, and we're going and we're kind of challenging to change organizations with something like Kanban, I like the idea that we can substitute the difficult questions that we're dealing with some simpler questions. And we can then use those simpler questions to help us maybe come up with some answers. And they're not going to guarantee success, though. And then the third one is The Design of Business by Roger Martin. So this is kind of one I've read fairly recently. Anybody read this? Yeah, Jabe's read everything. So this is a book on design thinking. So he's using design thinking to talk about organizational design. And this is his definition of the heuristic. A rule of thumb that guides us towards a solution by way of organized exploration of the possibilities. Actually, in this book, he has quite a few definitions of heuristic. This is the one that kind of stuck out for me most. So kind of rule of thumb is a heuristic in itself. You know, we talk about you applying the rule of thumb. Actually, I meant to say right at the beginning, when we're talking about Kanban, is it common sense? I said it's not common sense, but again, common sense is another example of a heuristic. So it's not common sense, but we can think about it heuristically. So guides us towards a solution. We don't know the solution, but we can use heuristics to guide us towards that solution. And it helps us organize the exploration. So it's not kind of just random exploration. We're not just making things up. It helps us organize the way we think about the exploration. And there are multiple possibilities. Again, we don't know what that possibility is. So he has this model called the knowledge funnel, where at the top of the funnel we have lots of mysteries. Lots of things we don't know the answer to. Lots of mysteries and lots of possible answers to those mysteries. And in order to kind of filter down those mysteries, we can then use heuristics. So we take a mystery and we start applying heuristics to the mystery to start getting some answers. And then once we get a good understanding of what the answer is by using heuristics, we bring it down to algorithm. And the algorithm then is something that we can repeat. So he talks about businesses taking a mystery, successful organizations that will take a mystery, decide on some heuristics, apply those heuristics to the mystery to come up with an answer, and then refine that answer down into an algorithm that they can repeat. So at the top, he kind of makes the difference between validity and reliability. At the top, we're trying to get a valid answer to the mystery, but it's probably not going to be that reliable. And as we kind of drive the work down and the problems down into an algorithm, we're going for more reliability, because as a bit organizations, we want to have reliable organizations. And we need to get a balance between the two. Kind of Roger Martin uses a nice story about a chicken. There's no pigs involved. He talks about the chicken. The chicken kind of gets used to the idea that the farmer turns up every day. And when the farmer turns up every day, he gets fed. So when the farmer turns up, he makes a prediction that he's going to get fed, and day after day after day, that's a reliable prediction, and it's a valid prediction because he does get fed. Until the last day, when the farmer turns up and he makes the same prediction, which has been a reliable prediction, but actually the farmer's not turned up to feed him. The farmer's turned up because it's his turn to be Sunday lunch. So suddenly that reliable prediction is no longer valid because he's not going to get fed. He's getting his neck broken. So there's this difference between validity and reliability. And the risk with organisations, and it kind of goes back to what Dave talks about in Kinevin about the transitions. If we kind of go down to algorithm, when we just get stuck down at algorithm, that algorithm is based on the past. We've built an algorithm and designed an algorithm that's based on the past. If the future suddenly turns out to be not like the past, suddenly that algorithm is no longer valid. And so we need to be kind of constantly going back and revisiting the heuristics and kind of going, is the heuristic still right? Do we need to kind of redesign the algorithm? Or sometimes kind of going up and revisiting the mystery, maybe solving different mysteries. So organizations like Apple and Google are really good at this. And they're constantly kind of going around and applying or looking for different mysteries. And you can probably kind of guess, something around Apple's heuristics. They kind of solve mysteries in the same sort of way. And then once they've figured out how to solve them, they kind of really refine them and get them down to an algorithm. Roger Martin uses McDonald's as an example. I think it's kind of quite a good one. So the mystery that the McDonald brothers were trying to solve when they first formed their restaurant, and they were a couple of brothers opened a single restaurant in America. They're trying to solve the mystery of when families go out for a meal, for a quick meal, what do they want? We don't know. So they kind of settled on heuristic of they probably want some simple, consistent menu that they know what they're going to get, and burgers. So simple burgers that can get served quickly. That heuristic was successful, and eventually, as we kind of know, McDonald's really kind of got that down to a really, really tight algorithm, down to how long you put the burger on the plate for before you flip it. So they've rolled out worldwide because they kind of got that really repeatable algorithm. Now the challenge that they then had was you had other organisations trying to solve the same mystery. Some of them, say Burger King, used the same heuristic, copied the algorithm, kind of tweaked the algorithm. And then you've got other competitors who use different heuristics. So Subway is an example. They used the slightly different heuristic around healthy eating. They didn't do burgers, they wanted to do healthy sandwiches. And then McDonald's had to kind of go back and try and go back up to the mystery and heuristics in order to figure out how do we serve that audience who wants healthy food. Research in Motion is another interesting example. They solved the mystery of mobile devices with the BlackBerry. Created heuristic, got it down to an algorithm where they could roll out lots of different BlackBerry devices. And then Apple came in with their own heuristics. We've seen what happened to Research in Motion. They've not been able to catch up. So you have to kind of constantly kind of going up and down the funnel. And at the top, you're looking at exploration. So again, Dave talked about exploration and exploitation. You're exploring mysteries, kind of drive that mystery down the funnel to algorithm, and when you're at algorithm, then you're exploiting it. But you don't want to get stuck there. So you had different types of logic then that we use. So the other thing that Roger Martin talked about is abductive logic, and I'm kind of blatantly stealing an example that Jabe gave me last night, which is around swans. So you've got inductive logic, deductive logic, and abductive logic. So inductive logic, you're looking at what is. So I see a white swan, and I can induce from that all swans are white. Having induced that, I can then look at a bird, might look like a swan, but it's black. So I deduce that it's not a swan because it's black. But then I can apply abductive logic, so that's kind of saying what must be. this must be a swan or must not be a swan because it's black. And then the abductive logics are saying, well, what if? What if swans could be black? The top two, inductive and deductive, are based on looking at the past, looking at past data. Abductive logic is looking to the future. So it's this idea that no new idea can be proved by using inductive and deductive logic. You've got no data because it's a new idea. You have to use abductive logic. So when we're solving these mystics and applying heuristics, heuristics are useful for solving problems using abductive logic when we're trying to come up with new ideas. And that means we need to be comfortable with ambiguity. So this is another set of heuristics. So back in beginning of February, I think it was, early this year, I kind of got invited to a meeting in London by Gochko Agic, organised it. And there's this idea that there were a group of people that were all doing slightly different things. So in the Roger Martin model, we all had different algorithms, but we were all kind of trying to solve the same mystery effectively. Which was, you know, we not just want to build software right, we want to build the right software. So how do we make sure we're actually having an impact on our customers? So we kind of call this heuristics for building the right thing. And again, this was trying to capture the similarities between real options and story mapping and impact mapping and hot housing and a lot of the different kind of ideas that people brought in. And one of the key things for me is this idea of being comfortable with ambiguity. When we're doing abductive logic, it's very easy for people to kind of go, well, how do you know that's going to work? Prove that's work. What data do you have? And if you're using abductive logic, you have no data because you've not done it before. So you need to be okay with kind of going, well, let's just give it a go. And that's where things like, you know, the small safe to fail experiments, when you're giving something a go, you want to make sure that you're not betting the whole company on it. You need to kind of get a go and maybe start getting some data and trying things out. Multiple experiments, knowing that some of them aren't going to work out as you wanted to. So, kind of worth going through this anyway, understanding your customer. So understand actually what we're trying to build. Let's not just kind of put a solution together. And some of the stuff Dave talked about this morning around distributed ethnography. It's kind of a way of understanding your customer. And be comfortable with ambiguity. We don't know how we're going to solve that problem, but we're going to co-create something. Kind of a distributed cognition, I guess, co-creation. We're not just going to, somebody's not going to come up with a solution on their own. We're going to work together on it. We want to learn fast. We want to have these kind of rapid cycles. And then we want to know whether we're having an impact. We want to know whether actually what we're building is the right thing for the customer. So that kind of brings us back to Kanban then. So I kind of talked a little bit about 3 sources of inspiration, if you like, for me with heuristics. So Dave's stuff with Kinevin, the Daniel Kahneman stuff, talking about the kind of heuristics about the way we make decisions, and then Roger Martin's heuristics in terms of the knowledge funnel. And that kind of when it occurred to me, though, the way I think about Kanban is as a set of heuristics. When I'm going into organizations, I kind of had this mental model of things I would look for, questions I would ask. So these are my Kanban heuristics. I kind of realized this when I was sitting down with a customer and kind of talking about the problems and the way they were working. And I kind of just sketched these 5 things down on a piece of paper and started filling in the blanks, kind of making sure I'd cover everything. So study the context. Study the current system. Now we're talking in Kanban method about starting where you are now. If you want to start where you are now, you need to understand where you are now. You need to know where you are now. So that's kind of studying the context. It's going to give us some understanding and hopefully a shared understanding that we can then make sure we are sharing with everybody. So that's kind of really the visualization aspect of it. A bit like disintermediation. I prefer share because it's just got the 1 syllable. Are you awake? That was a joke. I also like to talk about sharing rather than just visualization because I've seen teams kind of put up visualizations that aren't actually sharing with anybody. I had a great story about a a team in London where the manager created a Kanban board and then he hid it away in his office and you had to make an appointment with his secretary to go in and look at the board and make any changes on it. So he had a visualization, it wasn't really sharing the kind of common understanding. And then we want to start limiting work in process and just explicit policies in general. So to me, work in process limits are just a very specialized form of a policy. But what a lot of the policies are doing are putting some boundaries around the system. So Dave talked about kind of boundaries for complex systems, putting the boundaries in place, allowing the kind of the emergence to happen within the boundaries. That's kind of, for me, what the policies are doing. And then sensing capability. Do we know what the current capability is? So how do you know how good you are? If we want to improve, if we want to make some changes, how do we know what we want to change and why we want to change it? So we need to start sensing, and that's where things like cadence and some of the metrics come into it. And then starting to explore the potential. Starting to run some of these experiments, making some changes. How do you know you're getting better? That's kind of where something like Toyota Kata potentially comes into it, and PDSA cycle and some of those things. So that's kind of how I think about it. That's the mental model I use, and I kind of just came to this realization that I think what they are is heuristics. They can guide us, they can help us explore some of the problems that we're trying to solve, but not necessarily give us the answers. And we have to kind of explore, we have to run experiments and then sense whether we're getting any better in order to kind of settle on what the right answer might be. I just thought I'd kind of compare and contrast with the Kanban method. So as kind of said, start with what you do now is really kind of, it's implicit there. It's not stated explicitly, but I think it's implicit there. By starting where you are now, you're starting to study. You're starting to kind of get an understanding. You need to know where you are now. And again, agreeing to pursue incremental evolutionary training and respecting current process roles. It's really that idea that let's make sure we're not kind of just jumping in with changes. We're going to start and study and understand the current context. And then visualize, so that's what I call sharing the understanding. You've got limiting WIP and making policies explicit. To me, they're kind of that's one and the same thing. Limiting WIP is just a special form of policy. Managing flow is really about sensing capability. We're assuming that flow is a core capability we want, but maybe there are other capabilities we want to improve. Feedback loops, and we need feedback loops in order to start sensing our capability. And then improved collaboratory is really that kind of exploration piece. So there's a mapping there, and you could probably look at this, and actually you could probably look at this, David's called them principles and practices. You could probably, certainly the practices call them heuristics. And I think that's kind of a useful mindset to go into this with. If they're practices that you're just going to dogmatically follow, then the chances are you're not going to be successful. But if we can think of them as heuristics, they're just going to guide our decisions and guide what we're doing. That for me is a more useful way of looking at it. So this is the kind of the three things that maybe I'd want you to take away from this. When you get these difficult questions and difficult situations, think in terms of the Kanban heuristics and kind of substitute a difficult question with a heuristic or some of the heuristics. So you kind of replace that question with, well, what could I study about this to learn more? What do we know that we need to share to make sure we have a common understanding? What limits or policies do we have or do we need to put in place? What's our capability? How do we sense our capability? And then how are we going to go about exploring the potential, exploring the possibilities for change? So substitute some of those heuristics in to ask some simpler questions that then hopefully will take you and guide you in the right direction. Embrace abductive logic. Don't just kind of go, well, what's worked in the past? I kind of get driven mad by customers who just insist on having case studies. Actually, I had one client where I kind of refused to give them a case study, and it was probably a learning opportunity for me because I was probably a little bit harsh on them, a little bit overstrict because they didn't want to pay afterwards because I didn't give them the answers that they wanted for. So you're going to need to deal with that, but sometimes you need to kind of, again, shift in mindset from let's not look at what's worked for other people and kind of use inductive or deductive logic. Kind of embrace the abductive logic, ask what if. What if we made these changes to our process? What if we limited our WIP? What if we started collecting some measurements? How would that help us? How would that help us improve? And then invite surprise, because we don't know. what's going to work and what's not going to work. So we need to be kind of prepared and willing for things to turn out in the way that we maybe don't expect them to. And that's kind of part of the embracing the abductive logic. And I think we're trying to do that so that we can try to get this balance between validity and reliability. This is kind of where maybe we're kind of looking at the impact. Systems are dispositional. They're going to have an impact. We want to have an impact on either improving our validity or improving our reliability, and making sure that those kind of don't swing overly in one direction or the other, or we can kind of keep the pendulum swinging. And then I kind of added humanity at the bottom just because I wanted a third word that ended with itty. and I think there's that kind of the people aspect are important. I think kind of Chris talks about the people side of things. So we need to make sure that when we're doing this, we're kind of remembering that there are people involved in this, and people are the creative kind of force behind a lot of what we do. This kind of a little bit puts it together, and this is kind of what I call my Kanban thinking model. I've kind of changed the impacts here. I used to talk about flow, value, and potential. Actually, I normally talk about flow, value, and potential. But when I was kind of putting in the concepts of validity and reliability, kind of occurred to me that validity is kind of the value piece. If we're producing value, then we should be producing something that's valid, a valid answer to the mystery. And the reliability piece is about kind of improving our flow. If we have better flow of work through our system, we're going to be more predictable, we're going to be more reliable. And then the potential bit is kind of human potential, which is that kind of humanity piece. I'm kind of playing around with just changing the way I talk about impact. I don't know whether I'll stick with it or not. So those are the things, those are the impacts we want to have on a system when we're designing a Kanban system. And then to help us understand how to design the Kanban system, we study, we share, we limit, we sense, we explore. I'm going to close with another little story. I'm going to finish with plenty of time, you'll be glad to hear. People familiar with Strictly Come Dancing? No? It's a classic Saturday evening show on the BBC. Sort of thing you watch and you don't really have to think about. Where a celebrity and a professional dance partner perform a different dance style each Saturday night.
We have the same.
Yeah, the same. Okay, yeah. So
The
the name's different. I think in the US they call it Dancing with the Stars. I don't know whether that's okay. So Dancing with the Stars. So they have to learn a different dance style each week, and they get judged, and one of them gets booted off. So I'm going to make a very loose kind of metaphor here, comparison, and you'll see why when I get to the end of it. I don't really know anything about dancing, so if you do know more about dancing and this is complete rubbish, let me know. But I'm going to go with it anyway. When you learn a different dance style, it seems to me that you don't get given an algorithm. Not all kind of rumbas are the same. So I kind of thought, well, you could kind of say that a dance style is defined in terms of heuristics. And a rumba has one set of heuristics, and a cha-cha-cha has a different set of heuristics, and Argentinian tango has a different set of heuristics. And you apply those heuristics and you come up with a unique dance every time. Okay? So if I'm talking about Kanban in terms of heuristics, and I'm saying that a dance style is in terms of heuristics, we can talk about Kanban as being a style of development or a style of change management. And if I can talk about Kanban in terms of a style, that gives me the opportunity to close the keynote with music. Anybody know where I'm going with this? All right.
You're going to sing.
I'm not going to sing. But there is a well-known song about the Kanban style of development. Okay, I think people are getting this.
Get up!
오빤 강남스타일 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Op, 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 op. Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Op, 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 op. Oppan Gangnam Style. Hey, sexy lady. Op, 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 op. Oppan Gangnam Style. Hey, sexy lady. Op, 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 op. Oppan Gangnam Style.
And that is it. Maybe kind of quick summary. When you're using Kanban, think of it in terms of heuristics. It's not a solution, prepackaged solution. Use those heuristics to help you kind of understand the problem, substitute, use abductive logic, and just invite and embrace surprise. Thank you.